This video is going to walk you through the code needed to make a basic platform game in Scratch. I've simplified this pretty far down, so it has basically the minimum things you need to have in order to have a hero of some kind. A bad guy is shown right now in the form of this yellow block, and multiple levels. So if you look at the basic game as I play it right now, it's a pretty basic guy where he just runs around. If he hits a bad guy, it goes to the end, you start again, and every time he hits a portal, shown in the little circle, then he goes to the next level. And you're trying to get through without being touched by all the bad guys. So it's a pretty basic game, but it has some basic patterns you could easily adapt and turn into a more full-fledged platformer. So we walk on through the code. So you look at the basic code, there's a couple of components. Right now you'll see I've got stages with several different backdrops and 4 different kinds of sprites, each with their own behavior. I'm going to walk through how the code works. The first thing to understand with the game structure is that it's really all driven by the backdrop. The idea is every time a new backdrop is being shown, that all of the sprites are taking their information, or taking their cues from the backdrop, basically. So I start with backdrop 1, then I have 2, and then finally I have a game over item as well. If you look at the code here, you'll see that the backdrop is really the controller of what's going on. And I'm basically using broadcasts to coordinate all the different sprites together. If you look at the beginning, you'll see that when the thing is clicked, that it broadcasts start game. This is basically a standard cue that I can use multiple times to restart the overall game. So when the start game is received, it switches backdrop to backdrop 1, and it broadcasts this delete all clones. And I'll explain that as we get further through. Otherwise, it's basically the same sort of thing. It's just listening to what's going on, it switches the backdrop, and it moves on to the next backdrop. So it'll make more sense as we go through. But the key thing to understand, though, is that this is the kind of the core of the game, because this backdrop 1, backdrop 2, and game over backdrops are what tells everything else to do their thing. So let's start with the basic sprite here. Now, this is a pretty basic little guy you can control around. There's a couple of key things here. First off, you see I've got 3 different when backdrop switches. The reason why we have these 3 is that you want the person to show up in different places each time. So if you look at the first stage, I want for him to be right about here where the mouse is. The second stage, I want him up higher. And so the idea is that as I switch this, I need to tell him where to go each time. So if you look at the scripts for the sprite, you'll see that when I have the first backdrop, I want them to plop out right here, negative 200 x and 0 y, so right about where my mouse cursor is on the side. And then it has a show on there. The reason it has a show is because when it switches to game over, it gets hidden, so let's make sure that you see him again. Secondly, you have when backdrop switches to backdrop 2, he goes to the new starting position as well. Lastly, you have when it switches to game over, that it hides the sprite. Now, most of the other objects are going to use cloning patterns, but the simple sprite actually works pretty well, just having one object that's always being shown. Now, the main code that governs this behavior is right down here. As soon as the start button is clicked, it makes the sprite a little bit smaller, because I use one of the pre-built images, and it's a little bit easier if he's smaller. And then it has a forever block. Inside the forever block, I have 3 different tests. The first test looks to see if the up arrow is pressed. If it's pressed, then he's going to pop up by 10 pixels. In other words, that's what lets my guy fly. So in other words, as I push up, he's changing the Y by 10 each time I push Y. I also have an if left key moved and an if a right key moved. These both call a function called move. They don't really need to have this move function, but it actually makes the game run a little bit smoother, and I'll explain it as we go through. But these 3 are basically governing your user interaction for him. The last piece here is really important. It's called gravity. Basically, whenever I hit the up arrow, he goes up, but then I want him to be able to fall again. Gravity is a little bit of code that pulls him downward whenever I'm not pushing the up arrow. Now, if you see these purple blocks, these are each custom functions. One of the reasons why I do them this way is because of one really important feature. If I right-click and go to Edit under Options, you see you have this option right here called Run Without Screen Refresh. What this is doing is basically it's like a turbo mode almost. Built-in, Scratch has got a number of options, or a number of sort of built-in features that kind of slow down the computer. This is actually a good thing, because otherwise, with a forever block like what you have here, it would execute so quickly that it would be completely uncontrollable. But really, the forever block goes through the list and sort of pauses for a minute. This gravity, run without screen refresh, means that the computer can do a bunch of stuff without showing it to you. So with my gravity function, we'll start with that one right here, you see I start by saying pull the guy down by 2 points. And then I have a repeat loop. The idea with this is that as I go up in the air, I want this to hit, 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 and then at a certain point it's got to stop hitting. So what I have with the repeat block, it says repeat until not touching the color. In other words, if I go down by 2, let me just pull this off for a second so you can see how he falls down to the ground like that. As soon as he falls into the black, this guy is going to start executing, and it keeps on going until he's just on top of the black piece. You can see again how he falls down. I put him back in there. So it keeps on running until he's right on top of the black ground like what I want. Now I also have some custom stuff for move. Now I could be really straightforward with the move and just have this change X by steps. Or if I want, I could just do a motion block inside of this guy right here and make it pretty straightforward. But there's a cool thing you can get when you use this sub block here. The first thing that I'm doing is a little if function. If you don't have this if function, you have kind of a weird behavior, and I'll show you over here on the main screen. Wait till that guy moves out of the way. All right, so my guy comes over, and as he walks towards it, you'll see he kind of like walks up the wall almost. I don't even have to jump, it just sort of pushes it up. What's happening is that as soon as he gets where he touches the black, the gravity function starts pulling him up into the air. And so without that code being there, he just sort of pops up high. To keep that from happening, I have this if. Basically it says if I touch something with the black, so I basically run into a wall, I stop. The reason why it's stopping is because it says after I move, see if I'm in the black part. If I am, then basically go backwards. So I have 0 minus steps. So if I wanted to move 6, then it's going to move -6. If I've moved -6, the negative and a negative turns into positive, so it's going to move +6. So basically, this reverses that move function. The other thing that I have here as well is I have the option turned on to run without screen refresh. That way I don't see my guy sort of like blinking as he sort of tries to walk into the black area. It just looks like it happens smoothly without any problems at all. The other thing I can do here, if you want to make your guy look a little more interesting, is have this little piece right here. This little piece with the if statement is a test. It asks, am I moving a positive number or a negative number? So if I'm moving left, which is -x positions, then -6 is not greater than 0. And so it's going to point it in one of these directions. So let me show you up here. Once I click this on here, as I push left, my guy now turns left. I push right, he turns right. Now one thing to note about this behavior is you have to make sure your sprite has the right kind of left-right behavior. If I do it like this, now he turns upside down, which isn't quite what I wanted. So I have to make sure it's just left-right, and that way basically it flips him like a mirror. If I use this option, basically he's going to turn like he's a circle going all the way around, or like a compass going all the way around. I want just left-right behavior. The other thing I have in here is this next costume thing. Once I put that on, you'll see that he actually walks with his little legs as I step. It was forward, back, forward, back, forward, back. That's because with the costumes for this guy, I actually have 4 costumes. I could go walk 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so as it cycles through each of these pieces, each of these costumes, it gives the animation impression that he's walking. As you actually can see it flashing left or right as I push left and right. So that's all the code for this guy right here. It's pretty straightforward. Basically, you have him reacting to where the backdrop is, reacting to when the game is over. You have a loop that gets input from the user, gravity pulling him down, and a move function that makes him go in a certain direction, keeps him from sort of floating up walls, and then also points him in the right direction and does a little bit of animation. Let's walk on to the next piece. Let's talk about the portal. The portal is the endpoint in each of my levels. Now I could just have it like this little visible oval. You could also do it something more straightforward too, like you could have it just be like a straight vertical black line that's at the very far right side of it. Basically anything where you want the guy to touch to signal to go on to the next level. If you don't want to have a place that you touch to move on to the next level, you could also do something like having code that checks to see how long time has passed and then it kicks on to the next level. You could do things like once all the enemies are defeated, you could do other options, but this is a kind of a simple one to get kicked off here. So let's walk through the code. This one, when he starts off, hides himself. Now this is really an important approach. If you look at the simple sprite, there's no cloning in the simple sprite. There's one player controlled object, and that's it. And he's always there. He's just hidden occasionally, but mostly he's being shown. With the portal, I'm actually doing something very different. The portal has got one sort of controller, so it's sort of the master portal that's hidden. This portal, even though it's hidden, it's listening to these different events. So when I see this when backdrop switches to backdrop 1, the hidden portal is going to go to a location and then create a clone of itself. And then it's still hidden, right? So the main object still exists. It's hidden on the screen, not really interacting with anything else. Here's the key code. When I start as a clone, so whenever this spawns off a copy of itself, it's going to do this. First, it's going to show itself, which is why I can see it right here. Second, it's going to start a forever loop. It says, if I ever touch Simple Sprite, which is my little guy over here, then do a broadcast. The idea behind this is that this is what's telling all the other sprites in the program, hey, something important's happened. So that broadcast hit portal goes to all the different objects. Now, I don't actually have anything happening on the Simple Sprite, but you could. Like whenever he hits a portal, maybe he should like raise his hands over his head or cheer or beep or do something. You could do that. You could even do something with the bad guys. The bad guys all get sad or something. But the real place where this is being used is in the stage. Every time you receive a hit portal message coming out of the portal, you're going to do two things. First is going to delete all the old clones. Second is going to switch over to the next backdrop. So let's do each one. First off, if you think about this guy here, this portal is actually a clone. If I don't have that code called delete all old clones, when I switch to the next backdrop, you'll see that all the old clones are still going to be there. So now there's too many things. I got two portals and I've got a whole bunch of bad guys, which I don't want. So instead, I need to make sure that I basically clean up all my old work. So I'm going to put this back on here, delete all old clones. And that way, when I go to the next screen, this little orange guy is going to be gone, and my circle over here is also going to be finished. So now I've got a nice clean thing, whereas before, I had all the old clones were still being placed in position. So if I go back to this, so when I receive hit portal, delete all the old clones and wait till all the old clones have finished deleting themselves. Next, I'm going to go to my next backdrop. So if I started on backdrop 1, it's going to shift to backdrop 2. If I'm already on backdrop 2, it's going to switch to game over. Basically, it's going to go through the whole list here. If you want, you can have it a little more complicated, like go from backdrop 1 to backdrop 2 to backdrop 4. You can do different things, but this is just a basic, simple linear progression where we have each backdrop goes after each one. Now, once it hits the next backdrop, what's going to happen is that all the different sprites are going to listen to that new backdrop. So for my Simple Sprite, when the backdrop switches to backdrop 2, it's going to go to a new position. When this goes to backdrop 2, I'm also going to go to a new position. And then this guy's going to create a clone of himself. So the clone is going to be at the location right here and does the same thing it did before. Listen to whenever somebody's going to touch me. All right, so let's talk about the bad guy. Now the bad guy's got a couple of things happening here. First off, when he begins, he's going to hide himself. Just like the portal hid itself, the bad guy's master object is going to hide itself too. Next, it's going to listen to a bunch of different events. So first off, I have this delete all old clones. This is just a cleanup. Basically, it says, if I'm a clone, delete me. And it gives a way for the stage, like I showed here, to get rid of all the enemies and all the portals whenever I get to a new backdrop. Now I have code that listens to when the backdrop changes. So you see when I have go to backdrop 1, it says go to position and create a clone of myself. So if I double click this, you'll see that it creates a new object down right here. Now I have a whole bunch of enemies in this model. So it creates a clone. The master object is still sitting back, being quiet, listening. The when I start as a clone then is the code over here. It's going to say when I start as a clone, go ahead and show myself, and then do my behaviors. The behaviors are pretty straightforward. The basic one says to move a step and if on edge, bounce. Let me pull this out for a second so you can see this. Basically it says keep on moving left. Once I hit the edge, bounce and turn on back to go the other direction. These other two functions add on here. The first one here is saying if touching color black, this is going to change the direction that it's going. So let me restart this here. So I just have one. If I add this in, you'll see that as soon as I hit the black, then it bounces and goes the other direction. What it's doing here, it says whatever direction I'm pointed right now, so it's either 90 degrees or negative 90 degrees, divide that by -1. So whenever you divide a number by -1, it basically changes the sign. So it goes from a positive number to a negative, or a negative number to a positive. So it just bounces it off. And that way I can give these different platformers, platform enemies, different ranges to go to. So if I go to my next screen, just let me pop down a little bit here. This guy can go back and forth, but I can stop him with the black piece. And same thing with this guy right here. If I didn't have this little bit of code, this orange guy would go right through the initial shelf and kill my main sprite character. I have one other if statement in here that's important as well. Without this, I can touch these all they want, and it doesn't really do anything bad. Basically, it sort of stops the sprite from moving because I've got some black in my main character here, but it doesn't really tell anything or have anything negative happen to my character. With this if statement, it says, if I'm touching the main character, called simple sprite, broadcast endgame. And you can do different things here too. Like you could have something that keeps track of how many lives you have with a variable, like deduct 1 each time. You could do something that to change your main sprite. There's a lot of things you could do with this option here. But I make it pretty simple and just say, just kill the whole game. Now if you're looking to see what's controlling this, who's listening to endgame. My simple sprite's not listening to endgame. The portal's not listening to endgame. New game's not listening to endgame. Basically all these events being generated by each of the sprites go back up to the stage. This is the thing that listens. It says when I receive endgame, switch the backdrop and then delete all the old clones. So in other words, it's going to kill the whole thing. Now I can have custom stuff on game over. Like for example, my last sprite basically says show up whenever the backdrop switches to game over. That's all that's really happening there. But basically all the events being raised by each of the sprites go to the stage. The stage changes the backdrop and then each of the sprites listens. Now, it might seem a little bit complicated to have sort of this pattern where sprites talk to stages, backdrops change, and then it goes back to sprites, but it helps you keep your code really well organized and makes it easy to do. So for example, if I go to my bad guy here, you'll see I've got my backdrop 1 options are right here, and my backdrop 2 options are right here. And it makes it really easy to say what each of these guys should do. So let me delete all the old clones for a second here. Stop it, and there we go. So when I switch to backdrop 2, you'll see it has 3 different behaviors. Go to X position, create a clone, go to a new position, create a clone, go to a new position, create a clone. And the idea behind each of these guys is that it makes it really easy to modify the behavior. Let's say I want to have a clone up on top. If I want to do that, all I got to do is just duplicate this little bit of code, figure out where I want to start, so say like 150 by 60, 150 by 160, execute. And now I have a new clone that's going to make its movement back and forth over here for me. So it makes it really straightforward to add on new things and change their behaviors. The other good thing about it is that if I ever want to make my clones smarter, like say I want some little bit of randomness in it, I can just modify it over here. What if I want them to go faster? I can change it from 1 step to 3 steps. And now all of a sudden my game's a lot harder because now all the clones are moving around like crazy. There's a lot of nice things you can do with this sort of structure, but it keeps the code nice and clean and easy to understand. The last sprite I have, which is pretty straightforward, is just a button when the game is over. So once I end up hitting something, the game finishes, and I have my sprite here in the middle. And so basically all it does is when the backdrop switches to game over, it goes to the right position, shows itself, and when it's clicked, it broadcasts start game. If you remember start game was the code I started right at the very beginning. But the idea is that I don't want to have to click the green arrow every time I want to restart the game. So I rely on this broadcast called start game. That switches the backdrop to the very first backdrop and deletes all the old clones and waits for it. Alright, so I hope this made sense, that it helps you kind of understand how this whole thing is working, and hopefully it'll help you make your own little Scratch platform game.